Sean Ramiz, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, man.
You've said before, you discovered Islam, you were put off from how it looked from the outside. What changed? Was it a book, a person? What specifically made you want to switch?
All right, so we're just getting into the hard question straight away, yeah? So I think, look, my journey to Islam, right, is characterized by a phrase, I think it's a Greek phrase that I found out, and it's called metanoia. Yeah. And metanoia is about understanding or reevaluating the world from a whole different perspective. Okay. And so for me, discovering Islam was a changing of all my kind of fundamental perspectives. So really, it doesn't come down to just a book. It doesn't come down to just an experience. I didn't have some mystical awakening, but it was a journey of introspection. It was a journey of trying to understand what, values I really thought were near and dear to my heart. So the journey and the story starts after university. So I was lucky enough to study philosophy, politics, economics at Oxford. It's a bit of a criminal degree right now because of the people who represent it.
Okay, yeah.
But it was a really great experience, and I was very privileged, of course, because I just grew up normal state school. And I think the main thing that triggered this process of metanoia, or triggered this process of me starting to look into a different worldview, and that journey of introspection, was understanding or realizing that the values imposed on me at Oxford, or what was defined as success, felt very antithetical to what was deep in my heart. So, for example, those values would be, all right, at Oxford, you're using this degree to get a good job. Okay, that job must be some sort of corporate thing. You go into the corporate world, and then therefore that is your life done, right? Mm. A sort of, I guess, it's the Matrix type thing. Yeah. I don't want to use that phrase because of the manosphere, but there's truth to it, right? It felt very alienating to the things I felt were valuable, which was community, just like love for one another, a deeper sense of purpose as well. And also that, on that point of deeper sense of purpose, I just thought to myself, well, is that really it? Is that really what all this life's for? Mm. And I didn't really think that at a place like Oxford, I came to, I didn't really have a good experience of finding answers to those questions I had. And so to kind of wrap it up smoothly, that was the kind of big part of the process that sparked me to start looking into Islam. Because post-university, I went to Morocco. In Morocco, I then met all different types of people. I met Bedouins, I met homeless people, I met tour guides, and all of these very humble people told me something which stayed near and dear to me, and that's through Allah, I'm rich in the heart. And I thought, that's interesting, richness of the heart. That's kind of the thing I'm looking for, but I didn't really get the framework to find it in my time at Oxford. And so from there, I started reading. I started talking to my Muslim friends. I think part of the story that I've missed out as well is that I do come from an Islamic background, but I just wasn't raised Muslim. So in many ways, Turkish people right now are quite secular. I'm from Trinidad, and in the Caribbean, our attitude to religion is very kind of like, is very relaxed, put it that way. Very Trinidadian type vibe. You can go to the temple one week, go to the mosque the other week, go to the church the next week. And there's a beauty in that as well. Yeah. But I do think it also sparked a journey of rediscovery, where I started to realize that in my own lineage, my great-granddad, for example, was a huge Islamic figure in his community. My grandma who raised me, who's passed away now, she was born Muslim, and she did teach me some prayers and things like that, but she didn't really have knowledge to be able to pass down to me in a way that made me realize that this was actually a beautiful thing. So apologies, because it was a bit of a broad question. I gave you a very broad answer. Yeah. But I think that principle of realizing that you're alienated was where it all began.
Why specifically Islam? Because there's a lot of religions out there who can provide you that sense of purpose that you may have not found going to Oxford, for example. Why did you pick specifically Islam?
Yeah. So I think, it wasn't like sort of there's a menu and then you kind of look at the menu and pick like what your favorite course is. I think it was more of just a natural journey of falling into it. And obviously, if you sort of perceive your life as a main character, which I think everyone should, and you're trying to understand, well, what is the world teaching me? It was very interesting how I was just kind of naturally drawn to this faith. So when we talk about the specifics of Islam, we have to talk about, well, what makes it fundamentally different from anything else? And I think actually having that academic background, I wanted to find something which had a very, well, not necessarily I wanted to find something which had this, but I thought to myself it was important, or the thing that was fascinating, about Islam was its intellectual sophistication. It's
what do you mean by that?
So the fact that Islamic philosophy is so, again, sophisticated and profound. There's so many different thinkers. The preservation of Islam itself, the preservation of its message from 1400 years ago to now, and how actually every single piece of literature in the world could be burned tomorrow. And still, people will remember the Quran because it's deeply memorized in people's hearts. The humble believer from, I don't know, Bangladesh all the way to Tower Hamlets. It's probably a bad example because it's basically Bangladesh and Bangladesh. Yeah. But you get the picture. There was the simple message of the one God, La ilaha illallah, inscribed on the hearts of 2 billion people across the world, that unified them in a way which I didn't think any other faith was able to do. And the diversity and the different pockets of all of these different faiths. So, for example, people in Indonesia to Sudan to Palestine to Nigeria to all the Middle East to North Africa to here, like that. There's it's like a Pandora's box. Once you open it up, there's so much you can start learning about, and I think that was something that really blew my mind. In particular as well, the story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I thought was fascinating. In fact, I thought there's never been a political figure that I've read about that was so successful, right? And when I say successful, I don't mean in terms of like a domination sense. I mean in terms of like a leadership sense, in a way in which, I think the thing that's stereotyped right now is that he was this scary political military leader. And there's elements to that. There was wars that were fought, but also the kind of gentle nature he had to his community, to the people around him. Again, I'm sort of bouncing around all these different places because there's no really one answer. It's sort of overwhelming how much there is to it. And I think one of the overwhelming natures of it is the fact that it feels like buried treasure. Because the way Islam is talked about and politicized in the media, you wouldn't think that existed. I never thought it existed. But once you start to read one book, it leads you to the next, it leads you to the next, and so forth. And then you realize it's a very sophisticated worldview.
How long is the story of Muhammad? Can you recite it to me? Or like give me the 6,000-foot view of the story.
Of the Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah.
Okay, so it starts in a year 600s, around 600, 620. I mean, people debate all the time, 630. AD, and effectively he was, or some people say that he was just an illiterate man from the desert, right? People disagree on that though, so that's a bit of a contentious point. But anyways, he was a shepherd, and before the age of 40, just a regular guy, got married to a nice wife, Khadija. Khadija was a successful businesswoman, and he was known as Al-Amin. So Al-Amin means the honest one, or like the truthful one. And in his area, he was known as like a very upstanding figure. And so when there was disputes in pre-Islamic Arabia, he would be the one people would trust to kind of just say, all right, now let's stop fighting. Let's agree on certain things. He was also from a noble tribe called the Quraysh. So he's part of that kind of, he wasn't part of that tribe, but he was part of like these noble tribes, and the Quraysh was one of them. And the Quraysh basically governed pre-Islamic Arabia. And they had a lot of quite problematic views towards women, towards the way that they dealt with like business. They weren't very honest people, etc. And so one day, whilst the Prophet is retreating into a cave, alongside just all the nonsense that's happening, because he used to do that. He used to retreat, get some solitude. All of a sudden, he receives the revelation of Islam. The first word, Iqra, which means recite. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, which means recite in the name of your Lord. or read in the name of your Lord. And from there, starts and sparks a journey of self-discovery for himself, but then also the spreading of Islam, that in fact there's only one God, La ilaha illallah. Now, the reason why that was powerful, that particular message of monotheism, is because pre-Islamic Arabia was structured by pagan tribalism, which is pagan tribalism is just the idea that there are tribes, and then these tribes all have their own pagan gods. So it's polytheistic. So it was a huge revolutionary challenge to the social fabric. The idea that, those statues that you're putting up, they're not gods. What you believe, they're not God. Like, there's only one God, right? And obviously, to the modern mind, that feels a bit problematic because we live in a secular world and we should respect other people's views. It wasn't about not respecting other people's views. It was about the fact that with that, what flowed from that kind of polytheistic belief, that tribalism conferred a sense of superiority over one another. That actually my God's better than yours, I have better values than you, etc. But the pure monotheism was a universal message to say that actually we are all fundamentally made of the same stuff. We're all fundamentally part of the same creation. And so the oneness of God reflects the oneness of creation. And so it starts from there on a journey where then he begins to recite, spread the message. The first converts to Islam are the disadvantaged, the poor, slaves, women, etc. And there's a social justice ethic to the story where effectively he overthrows this kind of very pervasive, very insidious rule of the Quraysh tribe, who tried to basically beef the fact that he's doing this. And it's a very sophisticated story. I won't do it justice. But then there's a few wars, etc., between them, and then eventually he overtakes Mecca, and then dignifies the house, the Kaaba. So the Kaaba becomes the house of God again, because back then, before that time, that the Kaaba was used for the polytheistic purposes and things like that. So I don't want to get into all the details, but that is the kind of key thing to know about the story. It was just like any other kind of religion, to be honest. It's centered on the charismatic character who comes out kind of nowhere and has a sort of message that appeals to the hearts and minds of people in the area.
That's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you've obviously done your own research, you've done your own reading, you've came across Islam through your own inquiry. A lot of people will inherit their religion from their parents and they'll grow up in an environment where it becomes a sort of obligation to believe in this religion. Since you came about it yourself, has that changed your relationship with it in any particular way?
What compared to people who treat it as an obligation?
Yes.
Yeah, I think... So look, the term we use, it sounds like I'm a revert, and reversion to we call it a reversion to Islam because we believe that everyone's fundamentally a Muslim, not a capital M Muslim, a lowercase Muslim. Okay. And what that means is that it's just someone who submits to God or someone who's a creation, right, of God. And so fundamentally deep within our purpose is that kind of truth embedded within all of us. However, when you say the testimony of faith, the shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, it starts off with saying, I bear witness that there is only one God. Yeah, there's no other God but God, and that Muhammad is his messenger. Yeah, that key phrase is I bear witness. It's not my parents bear witness for me. It's not like these people bear witness for me. It's like I bear witness. And so, even though some people are born into the religion through obligation, I think it's quite a wide consensus that everyone throughout their entire life has to have that reversion process again. And that reversion process is saying with a clear, sincere heart, La ilaha illallah, I bear witness. And that's a journey everyone has to go on. It happens at different points in people's lives. I was lucky, it happened when I was, 22. Some people could be Muslim their entire lives. It only happens before their deathbed, you know? So that's where the personal element comes in. So I don't think I have any different view of people who grew up with it as an obligation. I think sometimes that can definitely transform into a very degenerate, oppressive thing as well, especially because you're getting told what to do. No, you have to want these things for yourself. That's how you truly feel free under rules, right? You want to follow it yourself. And so I think being a revert is like a sort of term I might use, but everyone kind of has to become a revert at one point in their life.
That's interesting. So this reversion process is something that everyone has to go through, even if it seems to them that they are obliged to follow it because of their parents.
Yeah, I think, look, people are born Muslim. It's just that I would say that actually there will become a part, there will be a part in your life where you truly think, you know what, I am a Muslim, right? Where you actually internalize it yourself, that this is something that I want to follow. And that's not my opinion. That's just like from me talking to actual Muslims their whole life. They say, yeah, I wasn't really a Muslim until I was like 18. You know, I was born a Muslim, but I wasn't really a Muslim.
Yeah, because you didn't really understand the fundamental, the foundations behind it.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting? This gives me some clarity on this study that I read, and it was done by someone called Richard Sosis, and he compared the possibility of industrialization between a religious and secular society. And he looked at 18th century societies. This isn't specifically Islam, it's just religion in general.
Okay.
But at least what he found was religious societies, 40% of them, I may be getting the numbers wrong, actually progressed and industrialized as a society. Whereas secular ones, it was maybe like 13%. And this seems like a really good argument for why people should be religious per se. But the reason what you said gave me clarity on it was they tried to take the traits that made the religious society and they hypothesized that if we put it into the secular society, would we get the same results? They concluded that that wouldn't be the case. And you'd kind of think why? Because if those are the traits, like sort of sense of community is what allows them to progress, why is it that if you chuck it into somewhere where they're not religious, you don't get the same results? Well, people in secular societies are just more likely to question the idea, like, you should do this because God says so, for example. Then they're more likely to say, why? They're more likely to be autonomous about it. And even if they do follow it, this is the interesting thing, is they haven't come to that conclusion by themselves. It's more, again, the obligation. So maybe that progression wouldn't happen even if they followed the same sort of characteristics. They haven't come to that conclusion themselves. Whereas in a religious society, you might have the reversion process happening way more often, which allows them to progress a bit more. So yeah, that's the sort of conclusion I came to.
Yeah, and so the argument is something along the lines of that there's certain values that religious societies have that allow them to have a greater tendency to industrialize. Is that what it is?
Yeah, to have a sense of community and work together, which you might not have that in a secular society because everyone's very individual.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, I think that's one of the sort of damning traits of a secular world, is that people have become very inward, right? We're atomized. That's a very intentional political project. The 1980s showed us that with Margaret Thatcher, right? That the kind of economic neoliberalism that she instantiated alongside Ronald Reagan was that people are fundamentally economic units. There is no such thing as a society. That's her phrase, right? And I think it has really dire consequences, and we're experiencing that now. A lot of the alienation we feel to society around each other, the fact that when we walk down the street, we don't talk to people anymore, is a very uniquely Western phenomenon. And that Western phenomenon flows from the fact that we don't see ourselves as part of a bigger story anymore. The philosopher Charles Taylor talks a lot about this, right? And he calls it the malaise of modernity. That idea that actually we as this kind of process of molding us as inward kind of economic units has very dire consequences for us and for our social fabric. And that's basically the heart of what you're getting to. You know, to what extent do we have a social fabric in secular society anymore? It's very difficult because, again, we don't see ourselves as part of a greater purpose. If you go to the Islamic world, it's very different. You go to even China, to be honest, which isn't religious, right? But it still has a good social fabric because they see themselves as part of a greater story. That art of storytelling and seeing yourself as part of a wider purpose is definitely lost amongst us. So even when you look at Benedict Anderson, who's a philosopher or historian, and he questions what makes the nation, what is the nation, and he has a brilliant book called Imagined Communities, and he says that the nation is actually an imagined construction. Yeah, you will never meet everyone in the nation.
Yeah.
In the British nation. You only know your neighbors, your friends. You might see some people online. So what really is the nation? Well, the nation is an imagined idea. Okay. So the extent to which you can successfully convince people of this imagined idea, to the extent to which people believe in this imagined idea, is determined by your ability to, again, push them to see themselves as part of a wider story. Do we have that in Britain now? Do we have that in the USA now? Probably not, because again, we have a capitalist society, which is just all about profit maximizing, where we ourselves aren't ends in ourselves, where we're means to an end, a means to a wider end of just, I don't know, just pumping out economic profit, boosting GDP numbers. And so like that mystical element, right, of Islam. And when you go to Morocco, I've been to Jordan, beautiful place. When you see these small communities, it's like they retain a definition of what it means to be human. Yeah. And from the secular Western lens, because that was me as well, right?
Yeah.
We can look at that and think, oh, that's a bit like kind of silly because they believe in fairy tales and all these ancient fables. Yeah. That's a whole separate point. But it's like, well, hang on, them believing in these ancient fables and these kind of stories allow them to actually exist in the world in a much better way than we do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Don't you think it's possible to get that sense of shared meaning as a secular society? You know, Jonathan Haidt talks about that we're 90% ape and 10% bee, and the 10% bee being that sort of swarm community sense of we all work together. He says you see this in people when they go to baseball games or football games. You have this shared ideology. We're all chanting, we're all singing, we're all standing up together. Don't you think that's possible without believing in a religion?
So my view is actually that deep within us all, deep within the human condition, is a yearning for that. Yeah. Like, I don't think if you go to a random person who's like atheist and be like, do you care about community? They're going to be like, no, of course not. Right. And that's what Islam says as well. Islam doesn't say that, oh, you're lost unless you have Islam. No. Deep within you all is a natural orientation to the good, capital G, good. The good being community, respect for one another, brotherhood, fraternity, these sorts of values. Yeah. What I think the secular project does and continental philosophy does is, for example, like Marxism and socialism, they would like claim and assert human nature is one of fraternity, it is one of brotherhood. Okay. But because they don't have a wider sort of metaphysics or some sort of like objective reality to ground that on, it becomes very difficult to substantiate in real life. And so is it possible in this country? I think it's possible on the small scale. I think London's a great example of that. There's no like religion, like structure in London culture, but the kind of intermesh of different faiths, backgrounds, multiculturalism does a good job at building some sort of fabric where actually there is some sort of community here. But what you have to ground that on is something that is sustainable, something that is resilient. Islam does it on, again, La ilaha illallah, there is one God. We have a sophisticated worldview, which means that our commitment to being a villager, so to speak, in the big village is something that is part of our very beings, part of our very fabric. Yeah. When it comes to like the secular world, we start to see that pattern trying to emerge and trying to sort of substantiate itself with like football, for example, because I agree, it's like a new religion, right? But again, that's more of like a degenerate form because it's sort of mimicking a sort of tribalism, a clan-like identity, where it might work for just that clan, but does that work for a wider society? Well, Arsenal fans and Tottenham fans don't really like each other, you know what I mean? And it's something that I think about a lot because obviously I do a lot of work in politics. I mean, first and foremost, I'm a political persona online. And cool, I'm a Muslim, but I don't really care if people become Muslim. I just think it's a worldview that helps guide my principles to understand how can I enact some sort of good into this kind of realm or world or this secular society. And I think it's just a very difficult question because I don't think it's been successful. Because again, what is the governing, pervasive, very sinister worldview that encroaches and undermines all of that? Again, it's this very kind of late stage capitalism, the financialization of the world, big finance owning our houses, owning all these apps that we use, it's owning everything, right? So I don't know, maybe that was a bit of a ramble, but that's where I would kind of conclude on that.
I'm not connected to a particular religion personally, but I will wave the flag for the side that you're on, where I don't think particularly that people who are secular have that, sense of selflessness in a way. I think people are rarely altruistic unless you have something that consciously overrides that. And in this case, it could be religion. And I think we're inherently, through human nature, selfish beings. And again, I'm going to bore you with the study again, but it was done by Dan Batson, and he took a cohort of psychology students from the University of Kansas, and he separated them into groups of 2. And the kicker here is that they had to do a task together. If they completed the task successfully, they would get a reward. And the reward here was a random lottery ticket. But the twist was that only one of them would get to choose who got the reward. So if they chose themselves, the other person wouldn't know that they chose it. They would just know it was by random chance. They concluded that 90% of the people who were given the choice chose themselves. On top of that, there was a coin in the room, in a bag. And he found that half the students actually flipped that coin. And he knew that because they were in a bag, they had to rip the bag open to get the coin out. And the question here is why did they flip the coin compared to the other half? Well, the week before, he asked the psychology students some morality questions. And the ones who leaned more towards the care and fairness foundation, they were the ones more likely to flip the coin. Yet, still 90% of them gave themselves the positive gift. And it's because if it were to land on the other side, they could just say, oh, I'll just take it. Or maybe he said that maybe it's because when they flipped it, they forgot who heads or tails was, and they kind of concluded it as themselves. Even if you put on each side player 1, player 2, for example, they still gave it to themselves if it flipped on the other side. And this study just concludes the non-altruistic nature of humans inherently. So I completely get this idea that as a secular society, it's unlikely that we come across this shared sense of purpose, because it's more of a tribalism way of looking at things when we think about the football games, for example, instead of a spread out for the rest of the community.
Yeah. No, I think as well though, I would actually even push back on that study even having much validity to conclude around an inherent selfish human nature, because if they did that study in Jordan or with Bedouins in the desert, they're going to get a very different outcome.
Yeah.
Right? And the reason for that, I think, is that that's another illusion that I think we have. We think that human nature is selfish, but that's just, again, an assertion where, of course, nowadays we have some sort of studies to back it up, but really I think we're conditioned to be selfish. There's a very different sort of, there's a very different conclusion to be drawn from that.
Dig into that for me.
So the reason why I think we're conditioned to be selfish is because there are structures around us which tell us that the rational thing to do, right, the logical thing to do, is to actually be adopt a selfish mentality to the world. Okay, so for example, if I'm a poor person and currently my life just feels like a very survival of the fittest world where I'm just competing with everyone all the time, of course it's going to feel like a natural impulse to do the selfish thing, right? And then even if you ground that on a further metaphysics, social Darwinism, which came out of the liberal philosophy, their fundamental assumption is that, well, human beings are animals. Human beings are animals. We're no better than any other animal that we govern over the world. Then, of course, life is about competing with one another. It's not about cooperation, it's competition. And so, again, fast forward to now, that is basically what much of our worldviews are governed on, right? This fundamental assumption that man is an animal. Islam, though, says something very different. It says that actually within us all, we do have selfish impulses, but we also have, not impulses, but we also have intellect, right? We're thinking beings. And so human nature in Islam is very different. Human nature says that actually man is created on the spectrum between the animals and the angels, right? Animals are defined by their impulsive nature. If you think about an animal, okay, throw food in front of it, just goes, runs and eats it, doesn't really do much day on day, they just eat things all the time, really, right? They just act by their impulses. The angels, though, are very different. And now we're going to get all metaphysical, spiritual, and Sufi. The angels, though, are governed. The angels, they don't have free will. Okay, angels don't have free will. In fact, angels are defined by their allegiance and alignment with God's will, with listening to God, with obedience. Right. So angelic intellect leads you to obedience. Now it flips the idea of freedom on its head, because in Western liberal society, we understand freedom as freedom of the absence of constraints. But in Islam, we understand freedom through a positive lens. And that positive lens is to say that freedom is actually around realizing one's true fundamental purpose. So man is created on this spectrum with both angelic and animalistic qualities. So those animalistic qualities and those urges are those impulses that we talked about, that selfish nature, that if I'm gifted a bunch of money, I just need to keep it for myself. But our angelic nature, right, the journey and the purpose of Islam is to tap into that, is to say, let's actually sort of ascend beyond that kind of lower self and then reach a higher self. And that higher self is to be like the angels. And to be like the angels is instead to actually, be very generous with that money and give it to the poor, or give it or share it amongst whoever's in that study, for example. And so I think we take for fact and for granted a lot of these assumptions about human nature, which is just an assertion. It's not grounded in any fact. And those empirical studies are done on studies of people probably from these kind of more Western societies. But when you go to the East, and I'm not just talking about Islam, go beyond that to China, to Japan, etc. Well, Japan's a bit of like an odd one because they're very Western. You get a very different attitude to how to exist and interact with your average person. So human nature is very different in that sense.
Yeah, that's interesting because, and by the way, this is not like some waffly metaphysics sort of thing. Like, you've touched on something that's a very fundamental concept, at least in how humans function. Again, and innately, I'm going to keep bringing this up because I've read so much into evolutionary psychology and biology. It's like the foundation of most of the things that I talk about. But at least in this case, first of all, I've got to add, Jonathan Haidt had this line which he said, our better angels pull us up and our inner demons will pull us down.
Real.
And it's like, this is exactly what you've just said. It's just the better angels who we could be, this sort of, but at least in the case of Islam.
Yeah, your ideal concept of your realizing your purpose.
Yeah, that will pull you up. But in fact, our animalistic instincts, the things that draw us to, I guess, again, the animal parts of us will pull us down. Those are our inner demons. And there are so many fundamental concepts like this. Like Plato had things about this, Freud had things about this. And then again, Jonathan Haidt had the elephant and the rider. So yeah, I think you've touched on something very...
and I think it sounds silly to like the modern Western minds, but then I would just ask, well, what actually captures the human nature better? Like, what's actually a more accurate way of describing it? Because I actually don't even think... I think it's such a very inaccurate way to describe humans as fundamentally selfish, or humans are fundamentally self-interested. For example, if we went outside right now and we saw an old lady crossing the road, your natural instinct is that, let me just go help her, right? I mean, you hesitated there. I hope your natural instinct is to go help her.
The reason I hesitate is because my natural instinct, yes, personally, it would be. But I know plenty of people who wouldn't have that natural instinct.
No, I know. But then if we're claiming the sort of sweeping claim that humans are fundamentally self-interested, is to say that there's going to be no human that's going to basically go and like help that lady cross the road. But actually, that person, when you go and help the old lady cross the road, you're not having some sort of self-interested calculus going on in your head. You're not thinking, is this going to benefit me in any way? You're not that thinking process is not happening. You're just saying, I need to go help this lady cross the road. And so I think the notion that we're fundamentally self-interested can just be battered away through just even some of these thought experiments. Even just the idea that, do you want your kids to have a good life after you die? People would say, well, no, of course, that's a self-interested thing. But how is it? Because you're going to die. You're not going to be there. So why do you care about if your kids are going to have a good life after you die? You're not even going to experience the material benefits of your kids having a good life. And so I think I always like to push back on that, because I actually have more of a, maybe is the word optimistic, but a nicer view of human nature that within us all is probably more of an altruistic sense that we all just need to tap into.
I'm going to softly push back as well. And I'm going to say that as much as we're not consciously thinking about it, could be a subconscious thing that is occurring inside of us. I don't remember the exact details because I read it so long ago, because I got really interested in altruism for some reason one morning.
Okay.
And there are certain parts of your brain that activate when you do go help out someone. Like I can't remember the names for the life of me, but to some extent, because there is dopamine involved in that process. So your brain could be subconsciously, or like the intellect could be convincing itself that you're doing something selfless, but in fact it's inherently selfish. My friend Angelo Sommers taught me there's just this idea of the intellect sort of operating in this self-enclosed area, and you can kind of convince yourself of things that aren't true. And the example that he used was the sort of life is meaningless, and you can kind of convince yourself that life is meaningless even though everything around you has meaning. But at least in this case, I concluded that maybe we can convince ourselves that we're being selfless beings, but to some extent we're doing it selfishly. And maybe you can critique this example that I'm about to give because it's fairly on like wooden sticks. But I thought about it in the sense that when you go give a present to someone, right, you might even want that gift for yourself, but the idea of giving it to someone seems to be you are more inclined to you enjoy doing that more than actually getting the gift for yourself. And that means, to some extent, at least what I think, is that you get more points for the feeling of giving the gift than actually having the gift yourself. So you're giving the gift, it might seem selfless, but you're getting this feeling which makes you feel good. So innately within you, the feeling you get after giving the gift is worth more points than the actual physical thing itself. So you are doing something selfish.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's definitely a utilitarian twist that people can put on these things. And I think there has to be something to say around the retreat to the subconscious. Because I feel like when people just say, oh, there's a subconscious thing going on, I feel like that is just a bit of like a get out of jail free card, which kind of hides behind the scientific method to say that actually there's something that's happening that you can't really measure. But all I would say though is that maybe that is like in a competing worldview, but there's still a fundamental mystery behind a lot of these things which science can't answer. Science can't answer the fundamental why, right? It can't answer why would you do this in the first place. It might be able to locate certain, I don't know, electrical processes happen in the brain when certain things happen, or like some dopamine hits, but can't answer why. Because fundamentally, if you take a materialist perspective, I think it's very unconvincing that, well, if I just all of a sudden got all the material to put a brain together, and here it is, I have a brain, that consciousness would emerge. I don't think that would happen. Scientists can't answer that either. They don't even think that will happen, right?
Yeah.
So what is that thing? What is that kind of spirit that's going on there?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I always ask that question to myself. The one example, it's like, imagine a triangle.
Yeah.
Where the fuck is that triangle?
No, exactly. It's real. No, and I think even just like that impulse, not that impulse, sorry, that thought, okay, is where all the great thoughts start flowing from. For me, I look at that and I think there's a mystery there. I don't retreat to religion to explain away the mystery. I retreat to religion to actually help me explain, not explain away, sorry. I retreat to religion to actually help me investigate that and actually celebrate that mystery in a way that I think science tries to flatten the human experience just to the material. But there's a lot of qualitative experiences that we have as well that science doesn't have the language for.
Yeah, I'll completely agree with you with the sense that, like, I'll wave the flag for your side with 2 points.
Okay.
And this is I find it interesting because I sort of explore both sides of the argument on these sort of things, and it's always interesting to come to. At least with the science flattening everything out, Dostoevsky sort of had this idea, and I read his book, Notes from the Underground, and he's kind of like yapping to himself for half the book. But his main point here was that if science can prove why you get happy, and it sort of explains your instincts towards things, like this, you act in your best interest here, you act in your best interest here, it restricts your freedom in a way that humans don't like acknowledging, because at least we like the idea of freedom. This may be a bit off topic, but his argument here is that if science can prove why you're happy, and it says that you act out in your best interest, where is your free will? Where is your freedom to choose what you want to do? And at least that idea is uncomfortable for a lot of people. So he concludes that people will indulge in suffering purposefully as a way to rebel against this idea that we may not have free will, that we're not free, because if science can prove that, then here, look at me, I'm hurting myself. I'm not working in my best interest to prove that. And at least that idea of science flattening things out is, I can see plenty of downsides to understanding that sort of side of things. And then also about the subconscious thing, it's a get out of jail free card. At least my reasoning behind it would be the self-deception theory, which is, again, I'll play devil's advocate here. It is a theory because it's based on how we could have evolved. But what it is essentially is that we have evolved to deceive ourselves with our own intentions. So you go give a girl flowers because you want to. That's sort of the way that you want to do. You want to show your appreciation, love for them. Well, in fact, evolutionarily, that would be as a way to increase your chances of mating so that you can have more children. But you don't think that. That's sort of occurring in the back of your mind because that is the survival mechanism built into you. So that's what my pushback would be for it's not a get out of jail free card because there's actual science behind it. But then again, it is a theory. So.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, look, I'm definitely not a scientist, put it that way. I'm furthest from it. But I think I also... The leap of faith, right, is faith. And Soren Kierkegaard defines it as the teleological suspense of the ethical, which is all this, a couple fancy words, right? But it's real. He's saying that, look, and it's not really related to science, but it's to say that our kind of universal or empiricist or moral understandings of the world, okay, might have to just be suspended for a while for us to actually tap into and for us to really feel immersed in religion or faith, okay? And the reason why I bring that example up is just because there has to be a sense of comfort for the religious person in saying that, yeah, like there are these scientific theories, but I literally just don't believe them. Yeah. And that's because I don't believe them because actually, like, what I care about is the sort of end outcome and the purpose and the goal. And the goal for me, or what gives me, or what I think gives religion, well, I say religion, but mainly Islam credibility, is because the prescription of how to live life and the guidance leads you to better outcomes than if I basically went down that rabbit hole and started believing that I'm actually just deceiving myself all the time. I'm basically just a mechanical animal, just, self-interest calculating all the time. Again, I think there's something around the phenomenology of it where actually the experience is not captured well by the scientific language. And I think that's why it still remains very unconvincing to a lot of people in just right now, to be honest. And then, just to circle back, that teleological suspense of the ethical story is actually related to the example of the sacrifice that Abraham supposedly would have to make of his son, Isaac. So when he takes him up to the mount and puts a knife to his neck, people look at that and think, how could God make you do that to your son, right? That's so wrong on so many levels. So his whole answer is that actually, no, part of the leap of faith is to say, well, my alignment to God is greater than any sort of ethical understanding I have of the world because I see myself as part of a greater telos, a greater divine purpose. And that's kind of where the disconnect comes from when people bring up maybe scientific arguments or anything like that, is to say that if it's not bringing me to this greater defined telos, or divine purpose, then it just doesn't land. It just fundamentally feels unconvincing. So yeah, that's just... Yeah.
To circle back, at least to the umbrella topic that we're going here for the first part of this conversation, is was there ever a specific question or something that you carry with you that nothing else could have answered, but Islam answered for you?
That's a good question. I don't think it's the case that Islam is giving me the answers. I just think it's a very profound way to understand the world. And in terms of ideologies that exist, whether that's Marxism, whether that's Hegelian philosophy, whether that's another religion, I just don't think any other faith comes close or worldview comes close, in my opinion. That is, in fact, even if we get very even if you go down the very phenomenological route, the Quran itself, the recitation of the Quran, the beauty of the sound, the orientation of every Muslim praying 5 times a day, looking at the same direction, that level of oneness of creation that is reflected by the oneness of God, I think is very profound. It's also the reason Malcolm X reverted to Islam, because when he went to Hajj for the first time, he saw how the white, pale-skinned, blue-eyed devil could also break bread with him, and realized that actually, hang on, we are all kind of the descendants of this Abrahamic lineage. And I also think that part of Islam, the thing that makes it so profound and convincing is because of the celebratory nature it has of the human condition. It's very optimistic about human nature. It's telling you the story that actually you can tap into your higher self. Like there is a better you, and you can get there. Not in like a self-help guru way, atomic habits, all of that stuff that they try to commodify and sell to you, but really that core realization and self-mastery is something I think is very profound. The fact that we still keep up the fast. It doesn't matter what type of Muslim you are. You probably know enough Muslims you see in the club, drink a little bit. When Ramadan comes around, they're locked in.
Yeah.
All right? And that, I think, is just a very beautiful thing, the preservation of it all. And so I think, yeah, from that perspective of it being a very accurate and beautiful thing, another worldview to understand the world, I think that's the whole point of why I do my content, to be honest. It's not to like, bro, I really don't care if people come Muslim or not. Obviously, it's great. Like, alhamdulillah, like, it's a beautiful thing. But really, it's just to say that actually, no, this mystical tradition can explain our world events, our current events, the human condition, human nature, whatever you want to call it, in a way that's far superior, in my opinion, to any other worldview.
I think there's a leakage between optimism and being unrealistic between the two. Do you think to some extent this sort of optimism and pulling back into religion, for example, away from reality, might be a way to avoid the downsides of what's happening right in front of you? So you sort of retreat back into religion to switch your attention from reality. Do you think that's something that happens?
I think that definitely religious people can become quite passive, and that passivity is not good for changing the world or actually enacting good into the world. But thank God I come from a faith that's very different to all these other religions, which says that actually no, belief is intimately tied to action. So when people see the 5 daily prayers, when people see how Muslims dressed, and when people see how Muslims have to uphold these values of modesty, they think it's very strange because they have a very modern Christian understanding of faith. And that is, for the average normal Christian, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and I don't need to do anything else. I might go to church on Sunday, but that's really it. It's just between me and God. And I keep that very personal. Islam's very different. It says that, well, if you're worshipping God, right, it's not just a personal thing. You also have to do things as well. You have to act on it as well. That's why the zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, where 2.5% of my total wealth every year has to go to some of the poorest people in the world. Here's a stat for you, because you like your stats. 50% of Muslims in the UK are living under the poverty line, and yet they give over 1 billion every year to charity. I think last year they said it was around 2 billion that Muslims gave to charity every year. And that charitable nature is intimately tied to the fact that they are a believer. And so passivity is not something for the Muslim. In fact, that we have to actually not retreat into like some sort of spiritual cave and do nothing. There's some Muslims who do that. I'm probably one who like kind of critique that action, because again, we're diverse people, but fundamentally we're a religion of action. And so for religious people, yes, it can make them quite passive, but for Muslims, it's quite the opposite. I also don't like the term religion, because I don't think saying the word religious or religion means much, because it groups all these different faiths into one. So that's also my sort of like little niggle of beliefs as well.
Okay, noted.
But you can still use the term,
Yeah.
but it's just something,
You mentioned there that there's some differences in Islam. I'm assuming it's just different people have different ways of viewing the book and viewing the religion, for example. Well, what are some of those places of friction and how do you solve that? Because say if you have two people from Islam who have come to different conclusions, how do you resolve that friction between the two?
I mean, there's no easy way. I think just broadly speaking, people who are Marxists have different Marxist views. People who are capitalists have different ways they practice capitalism. So I think people like to, and I'm not saying you are, but people like to point at religion and say, oh, you're following the same book, but you believe different things. Therefore, the book is like not true, which is such a weak argument. But putting that aside, how do you actually navigate the tensions between different sects in Islam? Well, first and foremost, the two main sects are Sunni and Shia. Sunni is the majority, Shia is the minority. They fundamentally believe on the same Quran, the same 5 pillars. So actually most of the fundamental beliefs are the same. Sunnis and Shias are fasting together this month. We all do multiple prayers a day. I think Sunnis do 5, some Shias do 3. But fundamentally that nature of giving, generosity, community, etc. is more or less the same. I think the big differences come from the political. So this is where I put my political hat on and realize that actually there has been a lot of forces throughout history which use this faith, the very kind of beautiful, perfect thing, and actually use it for very imperfect means as a legitimizing function. So for example, the UAE, right? I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that they do, but they're Sunni, I'm a Sunni, but they adopt a very specific form of Sunniism, right? Which is very quietist. Part of it is that you can't actually undermine political leaders. Same with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia have a form of Islam called Wahhabism. And Wahhabism also shares, on like if you had a Venn diagram overlap with UAE Sunniism, that you can't critique leaders, okay? Which is very strange because obviously Islam started off with the Prophet Muhammad, like I told you, as a very revolutionary thing. And I think from that perspective, it becomes difficult to understand, well, how can we all get on the same page? And I think that's like a political conversation. It's actually not a religious one because we need to dissect, well, what are the historical lineages of these particular ideologies? And you realize that you need UAE Sunniism, Wahhabism, even Afghan Talibanism, that's all very modern phenomenons. It hasn't actually existed for most of Islamic history. Probably in the last 100 years or so, they've all sort of grown out. Okay, and once you understand that, then you realize that actually, it's not an Islamic problem. It's a very human political problem, and I think having a general awareness of that fact is good for us to start at that starting point.
So the differences here are political rather than actually within the religion itself?
So there are theological divides, but I would say the problematic divides that we have actually flow from very political things. There's also another element of this where it's like, well, what's our source of truth? Well, we have a huge scholarly tradition, huge scholarly class. There are scholars from Malaysia, scholars from Morocco, scholars from Egypt right now, that all will basically create rulings based off, because they're people of knowledge, so based off the Quran, based off some Islamic sources called the Hadith, they will basically derive different rulings to understand how to navigate those tensions. Classical Sunni Islam, which is the one I follow, has 4 schools of thought, or the 4 madhabs, and there's great flexibility amongst each of them. Some of them say that you can pray a bit differently, you can do this, you can do that. All overall, though, they're all regarded as valid as well. So there's different ways that people can work through this, and so it's just around understanding, is this like a very sinister divide? Is this like a legitimate divide? Because differences of opinion are fine, but you just have to understand to what end, because the political differences aren't good. They're legitimizing like political entities and therefore kind of corrupting the faith. That's why I like this kind of Dubai Islam is not something that I would associate myself with. It's very capitalist in its nature, etc. And it gets messy. So, and I think that's why people rather like not touch it and just think, oh, it's all nonsense. But really, it's like any other worldview. It falls when you have a universal concept and it starts getting mediated through particulars, there's bound to be change.
Understood. We're touching into the political conversation here, and a lot of conversation about Islam in the media is political. So immigration, there's civilization clashes, all of that. I want to go deeper than that. What does the West get wrong about Islam, but not politically, but philosophically? Human nature, about what makes you as a person?
I think we operate on fundamentally different paradigms. The most important paradigm that I would say the West misunderstands Islam on is freedom, right? So Western society is governed by liberal understandings of the world. Liberal comes from liberalism, liberty, okay? That's born out of the French Enlightenment. And liberty seems like the most fundamental concept, the most important concept to us as humans. Freedom, right? That's uncontroversial. I agree. I want to be free. You should be free as well. But what do we mean when we say we're free? Okay. So for the Western mind, that has basically, let me start again. So for the Western mind, that has basically grown into and transformed into an understanding of freedom as the absence of constraints. So that freedom is basically the absence of any external interference on you or what you want to do. Okay. So Isaiah Berlin talks about this, he's a great philosopher. So for example, if you want to smoke a pack of cigarettes, you should be able to smoke a pack of cigarettes. If you earn a bunch of money, the state should not interfere with that because that money is a reflection of you. And then therefore you don't own that money. You own that money and the state doesn't own it. Okay. So that's the liberal Western understanding of freedom. Freedom is the absence of constraints. Okay. External interference.
Maximum autonomy.
Sure. Yeah. That's how you get to maximum autonomy, right? The individual who is never interfered with has maximum autonomy. That's a good way to put it. Whereas for Islam and for Muslims, they think about freedom very differently. And they think about it in a way where actually freedom is not just the absence of constraints, because who are you to say that you can even make the right decisions that lead you to being free? It comes back to what we talked about, human nature and the angelic impulses versus impulses, right? The animal impulses versus the angelic intellect. When, for example, an individual might pick up a pack of cigarettes or pick up alcohol, okay, the Islamic paradigm would ask you, well, why are you actually doing that? Is this aligned with what your fundamental purpose is? Is this taking you to where you should be? It's actually a question, freedom is actually a question of self-realization, okay? And so autonomy then for Muslims is actually intimately tied with a structure. And that structure are the rules of Islam, the kind of regulations, how you dress, how you should act, etc., right? We have all of these different ways to understand or how we should be, right? That's very different to like the Western paradigm where you're just left to your own devices, you can do whatever you want. But Islam is to say, no, actually freedom is actually, and autonomy is guaranteed through this hierarchical structure, because ultimately everything you do, down to the way you even brush your teeth, is a devotion to God, okay? That is the most fundamental misunderstanding of Muslims, I think, by the Western mind. And it becomes quite dangerous because then Mr. Trump will start to say that actually we need to liberate these people. We need to give them freedom, and then end up bombing the school, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's not just some philosophical abstract conversation. It's that fundamental misunderstanding of how different people perceive the world that leads to outcomes which is a matter of life or death, really. And I think that understanding of freedom is the thing that's been debated so much. Like even down to the way women wear the hijab. That for women is self-realization. It's guaranteeing them autonomy, right? But modern sort of choice feminism would say that actually, no, that's quite oppressive.
Yeah.
And so that's how also these things can be casted as problematic when the reality is they're operating on different paradigms.
That's very interesting. The word Islam itself means surrender. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To a secular Western ear, that might sound the complete opposite to freedom. So how do you hold those two things together?
Because ultimately you're surrendering to a divine force of goodness. You're surrendering to a metaphysical understanding of the world, which allows you to become your best self. Okay. So in Islam, you have something called the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. Okay. The goal of the Muslim is to always be on the straight path. You might sway from it. God knows I've swayed from it, right? But the goal is to always come back. That is your anchoring point. Okay. We have a rule book, or as some people like to interpret it, but that rule book isn't oppressive. It's telling you the best possible way to live your life. And people need to understand that discipline is so important for us to actually be good humans. Like if I want to be the best athlete, I have to put in work in the gym. I have to put in reps, sets, even when I don't want to. Okay. Same with Islam. If you want to be the best spiritual athlete, quote unquote, you have to do your prayers. You have to do your dhikr, which is like remembrance of God. You have to do all these things to fortify your mind and fortify your heart and therefore fortify your soul. That is something that the Western mind can't comprehend. And I never used to comprehend it either until I realized that actually what you see when people undergo this process in a good way is a beautifying of their character. And I think that the selling of freedom in the West as freedom as the absence of constraints, I think it's an illusion of freedom. I think it makes people think that they're free, but the reality is they're also subservient to big structures. Everyone worships something, whether it's yourself, whether it's the celebrity that you idolize, whether it's the fact that you can't walk past a shop without picking up alcohol or cigarettes. Yeah, is that really what freedom is? Because to me, that seems like it's undermining your autonomy. Whereas Islam will obviously say something quite different.
I guess the pushback to that would be is that it's the difference between creating your own sort of prison that you operate within. And then if you become aware of that said prison that you've made, then you can sort of pull yourself out of it. It's like the bird in the cage where it has like 3 bars gone away from the cage. People sort of ask like, why are you still in the cage? It's open. And it sort of replies saying, well, this is all I know. And I think that's the sort of paradigm that people will operate in, that you say is sort of restricting their freedom. It's that difference between that and something that you've chosen to operate in. Like these are the sort of boundaries you have to operate in within a religion. So I think that's the difference between the two.
Yeah, I would just ask as well though, like this idea of the cage, like to what extent can you even really construct your own cage? Because people think, again, this atomized idea that all of a sudden, we're just born out of nowhere and this is just us and it's the world. But really, like, your whole worldview is structured. There's no such thing as, like, the liberal worldview is not a neutral worldview. And then I think that's what the presupposition of the cage argument is this idea that I could construct my own cage and then therefore, like, I'm within my own cage. I could change it around and stuff. But the materials you're getting are from, like, the liberal world order. That is not a neutral world, right? There's no such thing as neutrality. There's no such thing as just like existing and that's it. Actually, no, where there's all these subjectivities mold the individual. And so amongst all these things that you can pick then, amongst all these preset cages you can pick, which one are you picking is the way I'd basically reformulate it. The one I picked, arguably, is the one that is grounded on me trying to align myself with perfection, the oneness of God. And so if we all kind of understood that actually we're just picking our own cages, then maybe it wouldn't feel so problematic.
Okay. You've mentioned before that the first word revealed in the Quran is Iqra.
Iqra, yeah.
Iqra, which means read.
Yeah, or recite. Or something.
Yeah. A religion that opens command to learn. So how does that sit alongside the Western stereotype of Islam as something like anti-intellectual or closed to inquiry?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it's my favorite passage because I think it's so profound, because the word read and recite in that way, that's how it's translated in English. But the actual Arabic word has a lot of connotations to a continuous sense of learning, a continuous sense of curiosity. It's not just recite and done like mechanical way. It's quite dynamic in that sense, that it's actually telling you to inquire for yourself. And the Islamic tradition throughout the golden age of Islam, the fact that we understand even the works of like Plato, Socrates, etc., they were all translated by Islamic scholars. And at one point, the center of the world was Baghdad. It was in Iraq. Okay. And we are just living in a time where we have historical amnesia. And because of like the political and social situations that we see in the Middle East, and how much of our memory is really the last 40 years, we don't even know how to go beyond that amnesia, because we just have no sort of connection to the accumulated wisdom of the past. One of the reasons for there's huge scholarly literature on the decline of the Islamic world. And one of the reasons for that is obviously because it's very complex. It's colonialism, colonial forces, it's destabilization of countries themselves. Like when you look into the history of what the colonial powers did, Britain, France, etc., they're just carving up countries as if it's just like something that they own without any regard to the local peoples there. And so there is, I think, a necessary reconstruction of Islamic thought that needs to happen nowadays, because we need to definitely tap back into that kind of scholarly tradition. I'm not saying it doesn't exist anymore. I'm saying that, tapping into like, that kind of golden age Islam, that curiosity of the world around you, astrology, etc. That definitely needs to happen. But one thing I would say is, like, for many Muslims, they definitely mistook a martial victory for an intellectual one. The decline of the Islamic world was not because of some inferior understanding of the world itself. It was because we had inferior weapons, right? And once I think Muslims start to understand that, and even like you said, like the first word of the Quran being Iqra, there definitely needs to be, and hopefully I'm in my small sense of like the mini videos I create, I want to contribute to a revival of that intellectual curiosity, which I think our generation are seeing now, to be honest. So ask me that in 20 years' time.
Yeah, that's true. There is a lot more curiosity around, I guess, plenty of topics. Like it started obviously from like self-help and everything, but people do tend to have an openness to exploration a little more, at least nowadays, which is nice to see. Islam also has this concept of fitra. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Fitra. It's just the idea is that humans are born with this innate orientation towards God and goodness. So does that change how you see people who may have drifted away from the faith? As in, they've displaced something that they already are?
So I think fitra is one of my favorite concepts in Islam. And I think it is a radically optimistic way to understand humans. Because what it's saying is that actually we are born perfect. There's no such thing as original sin, like the Christians. It's actually quite the opposite. We're born with an orientation towards God. Even when you look at a baby, what you're telling me a baby is just full of sin. I don't think so. If I pointed to the most perfect thing, I'd probably point to a baby, right? And so over time, it is the fogginess of dunya, this world, that makes us forget where we came from, maybe lose touch with our fitrah, making us lose touch with what we know to be right or wrong. And so the remembrance of God, dhikr, which is so important, is your antidote to that. It's a reminder that this is where you came from, and then actually you were born perfect. It's not to say that you're going to reach perfection, but it's to say that actually you can sort of, again, realize your true self, realize your fundamental purpose in a way where there's no guilt, there's no Christian guilt inherited from it. It's very different. And so when we see Muslims who have come away from the faith, there's some people get riled up about it. I don't think that's a right thing to do. I don't think that's a nice thing to do either. Because again, they've experienced a type of Islam which is mediated through cultural particulars. Rather, I think it's a beautiful thing to say that actually at any moment they can come back. And because again, it's the straight path. The straight path doesn't change. It's just people's navigation of it.
We're seeing something real here in the sense that young men, a lot of them Western, a lot of them with no Muslim background, are finding their way back to Islam. And the easy explanation here would be structure, brotherhood, discipline. But I don't think that tells the whole story here. What do you think is actually pulling them to Islam?
Good question. I think, you know what? That is very complicated. So I think, look, fundamentally, existing in the West can make a person very anxious. And those anxieties contribute to a lot of insecurity. The reason why we're anxious is because I think it's a very expensive world. And young people can't afford a house.
Mm-hmm.
Young people can't, get a good job. The school education system feels like it's rigged. And what we're seeing for the last 20, 30 years or so is that the wealth inequality has exploded. Okay? So all of these conditions contribute to a certain anxiety for just the individual. And those anxieties, again, like I said, can make people very insecure. And those insecurities want you to find some sort of structure, find some sort of worldview, or find some sort of comfort to help you navigate the kind of fogginess of the world. So Islam is a great home for that because, again, it does provide structure, it provides brotherhood, it provides community. But I think the reason why it gets complicated is because a lot of young men finding it in these conditions are also doing it in a way that's mediated through a different lens. A lens I think is quite degenerate of this kind of manosphere culture. That manosphere culture is to say that actually, yeah, those anxieties you're facing and those insecurities you're facing are all real, but it's actually because of like women. It's actually because of a different reason. They don't really talk about how complicated it is to live in this world. They don't talk about the complications of existing in this world. And so when people approach Islam through that insecurity and that mediated lens, especially if they're a young boy, it therefore means that it becomes, they see Islam as a very degenerate thing. Because the truth is, Islam does have a different gender paradigm to the West as well. There is a sort of yin and yang that exists between men and women. It's meant to be complementary. It's not meant to be a dominating force where men are meant to dominate over women. However, the way it's sold to young men now is that that domination exists. And the reason that you feel so insecure is because actually your power has been taken away from you. And actually, if you grant that domination back again through this Islam stuff, then you're going to feel whole again. And then also pairs in with the fact that they're also trying to sell a course as well. So there's a degenerate force going on this side of things. But then there's also definitely a very beautiful strand where people are coming back to the faith for good reasons. Not to say that they're not, obviously they still might have insecurities and anxieties, but the antidote to that is presented to them in a pure way, which is the remembrance of God, doing good. Even sort of ironically, one of the best ways they say in Islam to grow your wealth is actually to give to charity. Like these kind of more fundamental core principles, rather than just some sort of like manosphere gurus who see this ideology as something that can legitimize their very degenerate goals. In the same way, for example, like the UAE, for example, use Islam to kind of legitimize their political structure. I think there's these kind of self-help gurus. I mean, you can name them like your Andrew Tates, etc., who use it to legitimize their own sort of ends.
Right, yeah, because he switched to Islam, didn't he? And he at least allegedly switched to it and kind of used that as a way to legitimize the things that he was saying. Yeah, it's interesting.
Because they diagnose the problem, right? It's just the antidote they prescribe is completely wrong.
Okay. I do want to tap back on as well on like the entire, at least this thought came up to me about why there's this sort of pushback against Islam politically. And I think it's because, at least in the West, we're becoming a lot more liberal. And I talked to James Croft not this Sunday, the Sunday before that, and he's a humanist. And at least what he believed was the reason people are moving away from religion or the church in general is because the sort of political views that they take on are antithetical to what the West is sort of moving towards. So, for example, the church tend to have more conservative views on things. And when you have people who have a lot more queer friends, for example, it sort of goes against what they believe and who they spend their time around. So they're pulling away from that. And I think the same could be happening here about this pushback against Islam, because it has a fairly conservative approach to it, especially with like the yin and yang, the woman and men thing. I can see why that pushback might be happening, especially if that's what's taken into play.
But when you say pushback, from who exactly?
I think I'm kind of like referring to like the broad Western appeal from like the broad Western view of Islam.
Oh, I see. Okay, so like as in it's something that can quell this sort of transformational liberal views. Yeah, no, I definitely see that as well. I think one thing to note about Islam is that it's been very consistent over the last 1400 years in terms of its outlook and its worldview, and it hasn't been changed. I mean, the Quran's never been changed before, whereas the Bible and Christian thoughts has gone through quite a bit of like reformations. Well, the main reformation, obviously, with Martin Luther and the split of that. And that's all just I'm just bringing that up to say that Christianity as a religion or a faith, I think, it can be beautiful. So there's certain sects which are very beautiful, like sort of Orthodox Christianity. I think Catholicism as well is pretty rigid. But the kind of modern Western Christianity has become very weakened because of that Lutheran split. The Lutheran split was to say that religion is actually more of like an inward thing. It's not really about the practice. It's not really about how much you go to church. It's just to say that, do you love Jesus? Calm, you're a Christian. Yeah. But then like even the concept of Jesus has been so molded. They put a white face over him. Probably people in your comments are going to say, I look like Jesus because that's all I get all the time. Right? And but that allowance has basically meant that when you sort of interrogate who is Jesus then, right, to the modern kind of Western Christian, like they can't really define it properly. And so like that lack of definition has meant that it's not become a sort of spiritual home that is resilient to modern thought. Rather, it's something that is kind of weak. And so I think that's why you're going to start to see people kind of leaving the church. I mean, you're also sort of starting to see people join the church again. I think that's for like a separate reason of like wanting to find community again. But you're right to point out there's a lot of interesting movements going on.
Is there anything about Islam that you still wrestle with? Something that you're not doubting, but that you genuinely find hard or you're still trying to answer?
Well, that's a good question, you know. I think, look, everyone on their faith journey is going to have problems. I think the thing I think about, which is quite difficult to understand, is like I think Islam is a perfect antidote for like the individual living in the Western world. It's so profound in terms of helping us navigate it. But I also think it's quite hard to have a conversation around political structures, because political structures is where I think it becomes quite it's quite a dangerous topic, because basically if you start to grant like, yeah, there is a problem with like Islamic extremism, then the far right is just going to be like, I got you, there's something wrong with this Islam. But no, there is, right? Like, how can someone shout out Allahu Akbar and blow people up, or go into the street and cause real harm, whereas when I say that, I mean something completely different?
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that is definitely a minority, but then and I know it's a political reason anyways, but like trying to unpack how that became such a norm in certain parts of the world and certain understandings of Islam, it's very difficult. And it's also very disheartening as well, because of course, again, we talked about a lot of radical optimism in the Islamic faith, etc. But it does feel quite pessimistic sometimes when you look at that. Obviously now I think Islamic extremism is actually on the down anyways, just generally speaking. But then now it's also sort of replaced by this Sunni quietism of the UAE, which I don't think is any better. Well, yeah, it probably is a bit better, but in terms of like the kind of political structure of it, like how do we get there? That's the thing I wrestle with and the thing I want to learn more about, because insofar as, again, Islam is an antidote for like, you know, navigating the modern world, allowing you to tap into the beauty of the world again, you know, understand the qualitative element of experience, I think it's amazing. I think if I sort of pin myself anyways, I'm probably more of like a Sufi mystic, whatever that means to the Islamic viewers at home watching this. But trying to understand, the political element of it and the structures that emerge from it, I think it is hard because it's a very complex process. It's mediated between destabilization, colonialism, certain Islamic thought leaders as well. And I don't think there's been enough inquiry on it from an honest perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The people who have tried to like inquire into it and put in a lot of resources to figure out what went wrong, so to speak, don't have good intentions.
Yeah.
So there's that.
It's a very, very interesting answer. Someone who might be listening right now, maybe a young man, maybe not a Muslim, maybe not even religious at all, and something for the conversation might have landed with them. What's something you'd want the people listening or watching to take away from this episode?
I think what I would want them to take away from this episode is that, let me think. Islam is a journey of self-mastery. That's really what it is. The believer is not here to impose their religion onto any other people. That is the most fundamental misconception of Islam. There's even a part in the Quran which says, to me, I have my religion, to you, you have yours. We are not allowed to do that. That actually, what may seem peculiar, what may seem strange, the fast, the 5 daily prayers, the wearing of the hijab, the wearing of the clothes, is actually someone trying to better themselves. And I feel like when we hear about this in mainstream media, because it's so politicized, Muslims become very demonized, right? And all I would want for someone who's watching this, who's not really understood Islam before, is just to kind of break away from that narrative and understand, like, just like anyone else, they too are on a journey of self-realization. We just have a different paradigm to understand that.
That's beautiful. Sean Ramiz, thank you for being on the show.
I appreciate it, man.
Bro,
thank you so much.
This was such a great conversation. Like,
Yeah.
I told you beforehand that I wasn't exactly incredibly educated coming into it. I did some of my research.
Yeah.
And I understood some of it, but you've really educated me on this.
So, bro, I hope I wasn't rambling, man.
Oh, of course not.
They're tough. They're tough questions.
Like, not tough question, as in, bro, there's so much in it.
Yeah, of course. There's so
unpack.
much. I wish we could have gone for longer, but time calls.
No, it's all cool.
Or maybe we could get another one in sometime in the future.
No, inshallah. Let me
I'd
grow
love
a
to
bit.
talk more.
We'll grow a bit on both of us on our platform.
Yeah,
We'll run it back in it.
of course, man. Thank you so much for being on.
No,
Sean
for
Ramiz, ladies and gentlemen.